Alright, let's go. Number 10. The Bedolina petroglyph. In the Valcamonica Valley of northern Italy, on a broad sloping slab of gray-brown rock overlooking the floor of the valley below, someone spent an extraordinary amount of time hammering a picture into stone. Not a picture of an animal, not a picture of a hunt, or a god, or a warrior. A picture of the ground itself, seen from above. The panel is a sprawling network of rectangles, connected by lines, scattered with dots, spreading across the rock face in a tangle that took generations to complete. Researchers who have studied it identify cultivated fields, the paths that ran between them, dwellings, and human figures moving through the whole arrangement. Laid flat, it reads exactly like what it appears to be. An aerial view of a farming valley, the parcels of land, the tracks connecting them, the buildings clustered at the edges. A survey of who worked what, and where, pecked into rock by hand. Valcamonica holds one of the largest concentrations of rock art anywhere on Earth, protected as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, with tens of thousands of engraved figures spread across the valley's stone. Bedolina is the most famous panel in it. It is routinely described as one of the oldest topographic-style maps in the world. The dating is contested, and the contest matters. The bulk of the engraving is attributed to the Iron Age, but earlier Bronze Age elements are embedded in the composition, and the proposed range stretches across roughly the 4th to the 1st millennium BCE. That is not a date. That is a span of 3,000 years. The panel was not carved. It was accumulated, layer upon layer, by people separated from each other by more time than separates us from the Roman Empire, each adding to a diagram that the previous carvers had already begun. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Every person who worked on that rock lived and died on the surface of the ground. None of them ever left it. There were no aircraft, no balloons, no towers, no photographs, no instruments of survey. The highest vantage point available to them was the shoulder of a mountain, and from a mountainside, a valley is seen at an angle, foreshortened, in perspective. It is not seen flat, it is not seen from directly overhead. And yet the Bedolina panel is drawn from directly overhead, in plan, with the geometry that a modern surveyor would recognize instantly. That view existed nowhere in their experience. It existed only in their heads. What makes Bedolina particularly unsettling is not its age. It is what the composition proves about the minds that produced it. To draw a valley from above, a person must first perform an act of pure abstraction, take a landscape they have only ever walked through, rotate it in the imagination, strip away perspective, and render 3 dimensions as 2. That operation is the foundation of every map ever made, every architectural plan, every navigational chart, every satellite image we now take for granted. It is also the operation that underlies mathematics, engineering, and written notation. Somebody standing on a hillside in the Alps, thousands of years before flight, performed it with a stone hammer. And the panel is a record of ownership, fields with boundaries, paths with destinations, dwellings placed in relation to both. Whoever carved it was not decorating a rock. They were making a claim, or a memory, or an inheritance, a permanent statement about how the land was divided and who moved through it. The oldest surviving map in Europe may also be one of the oldest surviving property documents. The implication extends further. If people in an alpine valley were thinking in aerial abstraction before writing reached them, then the impulse to map is not a product of civilization. It is older than civilization. It precedes cities, alphabets, empires, and the wheel of recorded history entirely, which raises the question that runs beneath every entry that follows. How far back does it actually go? The rock is still there, exposed on its slope above the valley, the pecked lines slowly softening under Italian rain. The fields it recorded are gone, the paths are gone. The people who walked them left no name, no language, and no explanation. What they left was a view of their world that none of them could ever have seen. Number 9. The Catalhoyuk town map. In 1963, British archaeologist James Millart, digging into a low double mound on the Konya plain of south-central Turkey, exposed a plastered wall inside a Neolithic house and found a panel of red ochre painted directly onto the white surface. Rows of boxy shapes, packed edge to edge, stacked in tiers. Above them, separated by empty plaster, a broad cone-shaped form, speckled with dots, with more dots scattered above its peak, as though thrown into the air. Melart looked at it and saw a town. His town. The settlement he was standing in. Catalhoyuk was occupied from roughly 7100 BCE, and the painting is dated to around 6600 BCE. That places it 4,000 years before the field systems pecked into the rock at Bedolina, before the wheel, before writing, before metallurgy, before the first Egyptian dynasty by more than 3,000 years. If Melart's reading is correct, the plaster on that wall is the oldest known map on Earth. It is also the oldest known depiction of a volcanic eruption. One image, two firsts, both of them separated from the invention of the alphabet by a span longer than all of recorded history. The interpretation has a powerful piece of supporting evidence, and it is architectural. Catalhoyuk was not a village of separate huts with lanes between them. It was a single agglomerated mass of mud brick houses, built wall against wall against wall, with no streets at all. Its inhabitants moved across the settlement by walking on the rooftops and dropped into their homes through openings in the ceilings. Their daily experience of their own community was, quite literally, the view from above. The rooftop was the road, which means the people of Catalhoyuk lived their entire lives looking down at a grid of rectangles. And on the mountain above the plain to the northeast stood Hassan Dagh, a twin-peaked volcano visible from the mound, the source of the obsidian they worked into blades and mirrors. Boxes below, the cone above, the correspondence is difficult to dismiss. But here's where the oldest map in the world begins to dissolve under examination. In 2006, archaeologist Stephanie Meese published an analysis arguing that the panel is not a map at all. The boxy shapes, she noted, match a decorative geometric motif that appears elsewhere at the site as pure ornament. The speckled cone, in her reading, is not a mountain-venting ash. It is an animal skin, a leopard pelt, spotted and splayed, of exactly the kind that Catalhoyuk's art depicts repeatedly, worn by human figures in hunting scenes across the settlement's walls. Under that interpretation, the oldest map on Earth is a pattern and a piece of fur. Neither reading can be proven. The painters are gone. The plaster does not explain itself. What makes this particularly unsettling is not the disagreement. It is what the disagreement exposes. The dispute is not about dating, or pigment chemistry, or stratigraphy. Those are settled. The dispute is about whether a 9,000-year-old mind was doing something we would recognize as cartography, and the honest answer is that we cannot tell. We are looking at a Neolithic thought from the outside and guessing at its shape. The image is entirely intact. Its meaning is not recoverable. And that opens a far darker possibility than a misidentified leopard. If a map painted directly onto a wall, in a settlement excavated for over 60 years by thousands of researchers using every analytical technique available, can be indistinguishable from decoration, then how many maps have already passed under our hands unrecognized? How many geometric patterns cataloged as ornament in museum drawers across 3 continents are actually records of rivers, fields, hunting grounds, and mountains? The line between art and information may not have existed for the people who made these things. We are the ones who invented that line, and we are using it to sort objects that were never made according to it. The panel is still there, lifted from its wall and preserved. Red ochre on white plaster, boxes beneath a spotted cone. It has been studied for 6 decades, and it has surrendered nothing. And there is one detail that keeps the map reading alive, despite everything. One piece of evidence that came not from the plaster, but from the mountain itself. Number 8. The Hassan Dagh eruption record. Roughly 130 kilometers northeast of Catalhoyuk, a twin-peaked volcano rises out of the Anatolian plain. Hassan Dagh is visible from the mound on a clear day, a pale cone standing above flat farmland, and for most of the 20th century, it was treated as a scenic detail in an argument about a wall painting. The mural at Catalhoyuk had been read as a town plan with an erupting mountain behind it. Skeptics pointed out the obvious problem. There was no evidence the mountain had erupted while anyone was alive to watch. Then geologists climbed it. Volcanic rock keeps its own calendar. When magma cools, it grows zircon crystals, and those crystals trap uranium as they form. The decay of that uranium into thorium and lead can be measured with laboratory precision, which means a lump of pumice lying on a mountainside carries a timestamp written the moment it hardened. Samples collected from Hassan Dagh's summit dome and its flanks were dated using exactly this method. The results placed an explosive eruption within the window of human occupation at Catalhoyuk. Not thousands of years before the settlement was founded. Not thousands of years after it was abandoned. During it. The people who plastered and repainted those walls had watched that mountain erupt. The scale matters. Catalhoyuk was not a village. At its height, it housed somewhere between 3,000 and 8,000 people packed into mud brick houses built wall against wall, with no streets, entered through holes in the roof. It was one of the largest concentrations of human beings on the planet at the time. And every one of those roofs faced a horizon with a volcano on it. An eruption at that distance would have delivered a column of ash visible from the entire plain, a sky turning the wrong color in the middle of the day, and a sound that would have arrived minutes after the sight. But here's where the interpretation of the mural changes shape entirely. Once the eruption is confirmed as a lived event rather than a geological abstraction, the speckled cone motif in the red ochre stops being a decorative pattern and becomes a description. The spots above the triangular form read as ejected rock and ash, the boxy shapes beneath it read as the settlement itself, laid out flat, seen from a vantage point no human of 6600 BCE could physically occupy. Geography above, catastrophe on top of it, both in the same frame. And the motif does not appear only once. Volcanic imagery echoes across Neolithic Anatolian art from the wider region, in patterns of cones and scattered points that repeat across sites and centuries. A single mural can be dismissed as an accident of pigment. A recurring vocabulary cannot. Something in that landscape was being represented deliberately, repeatedly, by people who had no writing system with which to explain themselves. What makes this particularly unsettling is what it implies about why humans began drawing the land at all. The comfortable assumption is that mapping is a tool of ambition. We chart terrain to travel it, to farm it, to claim it, to tax it. That assumption may be backwards. The oldest candidate for a map in the human record is not a route between 2 points. It is a place and a disaster occupying the same surface. Not navigation, not property, memory. The truly disturbing aspect is the purpose such an image would serve. A picture of your own town, with a mountain exploding above it, is not a wayfinding aid. It is either a warning aimed at people not yet born, or a wound that someone needed to fix in place so it could not be forgotten. Possibly both. The first cartographers may not have been surveyors. They may have been survivors. The mountain is still there. Hassan Das still stands over the same plain, quiet now, its slopes littered with the pumice that dated its own violence. 11 kilometers of excavated mud brick lie between it and the wall where someone pressed ochre into wet plaster with their fingers and drew the thing they had seen. The plaster survived, the ash cloud did not, and the reason a human being felt compelled to record that moment on the inside of a room, where only their own family would ever see it, remains locked in a gesture made 90 centuries ago by a person whose name was never written down. Number 7. The Honey Hunter of Aranya. On a pale limestone wall inside a shallow rock shelter in the hills west of Valencia, Spain, a slender human figure hangs in midair. The body is rendered in reddish pigment, elongated, almost weightless, one arm reaching upward into a cloud of dots. The dots are bees. The figure is climbing a set of thin, ladder-like lines that rise from the base of the panel toward a hollow in the rock, where the swarm has made its home. In one hand, a container. Around the climber, a scatter of insects that appear to be in motion. The paintings at the Cuevas de la Araña date to roughly 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, in the Mesolithic, the long interval after the ice sheets retreated and before agriculture reorganized human life. The people who made these images did not farm. They did not build cities. They moved through a landscape of cliffs, ravines, and seasonal rivers, tracking animals and gathering what the terrain provided. And on that pale rock, in ochre that has survived 10 millennia of heat and dust, one of them recorded something more sophisticated than a portrait. The figure is not floating in empty space. The panel places him inside a rendered environment. The lines he climbs correspond to the structure of the cliff. The hive sits where a hive would sit, in a fissure above a drop. The composition establishes a vertical relationship between the ground, the climber, the ropes or ladders, and the reward waiting above. This is not decoration. It is spatial information, arranged so that the relationships between elements carry meaning. Consider what that requires. To paint this scene, the artist had to hold in mind a location, an approach route, a vertical distance, a hazard, and a resource, and then translate all of it onto a flat surface in a way another human being could read. The vocabulary is minimal: reddish figures, lines, dots. From those three elements, an entire operational picture emerges. But here's where the honey hunter stops being a picture and becomes something closer to a document. Honey is not incidental food. In a pre-agricultural diet, it is the densest concentration of calories available in the natural world, and it does not move. Game migrates. Rivers shift. Plants ripen and rot on a schedule. A wild hive occupies a specific crevice in a specific cliff, and it stays there, sometimes for generations. Information about its location has extraordinary value. The panel at Aranya encodes exactly that information: the place, the method, the tools, the danger, which means it functions as a proto-map, not a map of territory in the abstract, not a survey of boundaries, but a map of a resource. Here is where the honey is. Here is how you reach it. Here is what happens when you do. What makes this particularly haunting is the implication of an intended reader. A memory aid needs no witness. A painting on a shelter wall, positioned where light reaches it, addressed to whoever came next, is a transmission. Someone painted the route because someone else would need it. The knowledge that kept a community alive was too important to leave inside a single skull, and the surrounding panels reinforce the reading. The site does not show isolated symbols floating in nothing. It shows human activity placed inside a rendered landscape, hunters and animals and terrain composed together, action situated in space. This is spatial storytelling. It is the moment when the human mind stopped depicting things and began depicting the relationships between things. Every scholar who studies these images works in the same fundamental darkness. We do not know who painted the climber. We do not know whether he was a real person, a remembered ancestor, or an instruction manual rendered in the shape of a man. We do not know whether the container in his hand held honey or something ceremonial. The pigment survived. The intention did not. The cliffs above Bicorp are still there. Wild bees still nest in the fissures of eastern Spanish limestone, in hollows very much like the one painted on that wall. The honey is still where the painting says it is. The route is still climbable. Only the climbers are gone, along with whatever language they used to explain to their children what the dots meant, leaving a survival document on a rock face that outlasted everyone who could read it. Number 6. The Maps of the Green Sahara. In 1956, the French explorer Henri Lot arrived at a plateau in southeastern Algeria called Tassili N'Ajjer, a labyrinth of wind-carved sandstone towers standing in one of the driest places on the planet. There is almost no water there. There is almost no life. What Lotte and the teams that followed him documented across those sun-baked cliffs was a landscape that could not possibly have existed where they were standing. Rivers, marshes, herds of long-horned cattle driven by figures with sticks, hippopotamuses, swimmers, arms extended, bodies rendered mid-stroke in ochre and white. Boats, painted on rock, faces hundreds of kilometers from the nearest permanent water. The rock art of Tassili N'Ajjer and the related sites scattered across the central Sahara spans a period between roughly 10,000 and 6,000 years ago. The panels are not small. They stretch across cliff walls and shelter ceilings in compositions that run for meters, populated by hundreds of individual figures, layered by generation upon generation of painters returning to the same stone. Cattle are shown in organized herds with distinct markings, suggesting individual animals were recognized and recorded. Human figures appear in groups, in procession, in the water. Wild species now confined to tropical Africa thousands of kilometers to the south appear here as ordinary neighbors, painted with the casual accuracy of people who saw them every day. This is not fantasy. This is not myth-making. Every animal in those panels was drawn from life. The Sahara these painters inhabited was green. Grasslands stretched across territory that is now pure sand. River systems ran where there is now nothing but stone and heat. Lakes filled basins that have held no water for millennia. The people who worked those cliff faces lived in a well-watered world of pasture and marsh and moving herds, and they recorded that world in extraordinary detail on the walls above it. Terrain, water, animals, routes. Not a single cliff face documenting a single valley, but a distributed record spread across a region larger than most continents, painted by cultures who never conceived of themselves as cartographers. But here's where the Saharan panels become something far more disturbing than art. The landscape they depict does not exist anywhere on Earth, not degraded, not relocated, gone. There is no surviving stretch of the planet's surface that looks like the world in those paintings. No place a researcher can travel to compare the image against the reality. Every other prehistoric map humanity has recovered can be tested against the ground it describes. The valley is still a valley. The mountain is still a mountain. The Saharan panels describe territory that has been annihilated so completely that the paintings are the only remaining witness to it. And the people who made them watched it happen. The drying was not instantaneous. Rainfall retreated over centuries as the monsoon belt shifted southward, and the pastoral communities of the Sahara experienced that retreat as a slow, generational strangulation. The later phases of the rock art record the change directly. Hippos and swimmers give way to cattle. Cattle give way to horses. Horses give way to camels. The animal of the desert. The animal of a world where water must be carried rather than found. The panels are stacked in chronological layers on the same walls, and reading upward through them is reading the death of a homeland in real time. What makes this particularly haunting is the intent. These were not warnings. These were not archives compiled for the benefit of the future. They were the ordinary visual language of people describing the places they knew, painted with no expectation that the places themselves would ever cease to be. The map outlived its territory by 6,000 years. The record survived. The world it recorded evaporated. The panels are still there. They sit in dry shelters under a sun that has not been interrupted by significant rain in thousands of years, preserved by the very aridity that destroyed everything they depict. Cattle graze on grass that has not existed since before the pyramids. Swimmers reach through water that vanished before writing was invented. And the herders who painted them walked away, generation by generation, toward whatever water was left, leaving behind the only surviving map of a drowned green continent on the walls of the desert that consumed it. Number 5. The Abauntz Stone. A palm-sized slab of rock, pulled from a cave floor in the Spanish Pyrenees, that may be the oldest landscape map in Western Europe. The cave is called Abauntz, tucked into the mountains of Navarre in northern Spain. Excavations there recovered thousands of objects across decades of work, most of them ordinary by the standards of Upper Paleolithic archaeology. Flint, bone, ash from hearths, and among them, a flat piece of stone small enough to close a hand around, its surface covered in a dense tangle of overlapping engraved lines. For years it read as decoration, abstract marks, the kind of ambiguous scratching that fills museum drawers across Europe, catalogued and shelved and largely ignored. In 2009, a team led by archaeologist Pilar Utrilla at the University of Zaragoza published an analysis in the Journal of Human Evolution, arguing that the marks were not decoration at all, they were geography. The stone dates to approximately 13,660 years ago. That places it deep in the late Ice Age, thousands of years before the first farming village, before pottery, before the domestication of a single animal. The people who made it hunted in a Europe still gripped by glacial cold, in a world where the Sahara was not yet green and the North Sea was not yet a sea. And on that stone, according to the analysis, they carved a picture of the land. The engravings resolve into a coherent scene when read as terrain. Sets of lines that correspond to the profile of nearby mountains, sinuous forms interpreted as rivers cutting through valleys, and distributed across that landscape, animal figures, herds, ibex, deer, and other game rendered not as isolated portraits, but as inhabitants of a mapped space, placed in relation to the geography around them. The scale is what makes it extraordinary. This is not a monument. It is not a wall, not a cliff face, not a painted chamber requiring a lamp and a lifetime of ritual knowledge to reach. It is an object that fits in a palm, portable, something a person could carry into the field and consult. But here is where the interpretation becomes genuinely unsettling. If the reading is correct, the Abauntz Stone is not simply a record of what the landscape looked like, it is a plan for what to do in it. The engravings mix geography and animals in the same visual field, which means the mountains and rivers are not the subject, they are the framework. The herds are positioned within the terrain, and terrain determines everything about a hunt on foot with stone-tipped weapons, where the animals graze, where the valleys narrow, where a river blocks escape, where a group of people can wait. That is not art, that is strategy. It implies something about the minds behind it that the archaeological record almost never gives us directly. To carve that stone, a person had to hold a mental model of a landscape they could only ever have experienced from inside it, at ground level, one valley at a time, and then rotate that model into an aerial abstraction. They had to compress kilometers of mountain country into the width of a hand. They had to agree, with whoever they showed it to, that a scratched line meant a river, that a mark meant a mountain, that this shape here stood for a place over there. A shared symbolic convention for representing space, in use during the last ice age. Some researchers dispute the reading. Ambiguous engravings invite ambiguous conclusions, and a dense lattice of overlapping lines can be made to resemble almost anything by a determined eye. The debate continues. But the object itself is not in dispute, neither is its age, and neither is the uncomfortable arithmetic that follows from it. If people were sketching terrain and prey onto portable stone 13,660 years ago, then the impulse to map was not born with cities or agriculture or writing. It was already fully formed in hunter-gatherers, and this single surviving example is almost certainly not the first attempt. It is the one that happened to be made of stone in a cave that happened to be excavated. The rest were made of wood, of hide, of dirt scraped flat with a hand and pointed at, and then walked over. The Abauntz Stone sits in a Spanish collection today, small enough to be overlooked, a dense knot of lines that took 13,000 years to be recognized as a picture of a place. The mountains it may depict are still standing. The herds are gone. So are the hunters who needed to know where they were. Number 4. The Mammoth Ivory Map. In 1965, a farmer digging a cellar behind his house in the village of Mezhyrich, Ukraine, struck something in the soil that would not break. It was a jawbone. Beneath it were more, dozens more, interlocked and stacked in a deliberate curve. What he had cut into was not a burial. It was a house, and the house was built out of mammoths. Mezhyrich is one of the most famous Ice Age settlements ever excavated. The dwellings recovered there were assembled from the skeletal remains of mammoth, mandibles arranged in interlocking rows to form load-bearing walls, long bones, and tusks framing the roof, skulls set as anchors along the base. Hundreds of individual bones went into a single structure. These were not lean toes thrown up for a season. They were engineered, permanent, deliberate architecture raised on a treeless plain, where the only available building material was the animal the inhabitants hunted, ate, wore, and burned. And then, among the debris of that settlement, excavators recovered a fragment of engraved mammoth ivory, roughly 15,000 years old. The object is unremarkable to look at. Yellowed, cracked, no larger than a hand, the surface dulled by 15 millennia in cold ground. But cut into that surface are fine incised lines, and the lines are not random. They form patterns. Rectangular shapes cluster together in a group. Beside them, a series of wavy parallel lines runs across the ivory in a continuous band. Rectangles and a river. Some researchers have interpreted the engraving as exactly that, a depiction of dwellings set alongside a watercourse, a rendering of the ground the carver was standing on. If the interpretation holds, the implications are staggering. It would mean that hunter-gatherers living through the depths of the last ice age were sketching their local geography, not decorating, not doodling, recording, taking the arrangement of their own settlement and the shape of the water beside it and translating it into abstract marks on a portable surface that could be carried, shown, and read by someone else. But here's where the object becomes genuinely disturbing to think about. The rectangles on that ivory may portray the mammoth bone huts of Mezhyrich itself, which means the map was carved from the tusk of the same species whose skeletons formed the buildings the map depicts. The animal was the wall, the animal was the roof, the animal was the fuel, and the animal was the page. A human being took a piece of a mammoth, and on it drew the houses made of mammoths, and beside them drew the river that fed the herd. There is no separation anywhere in that equation. The medium, the subject, the shelter, and the food are all one creature. That is not a map of territory in the modern sense. It is a map of dependency. Consider the mental operation required. To carve that engraving, the maker had to lift out of their own body and imagine the settlement from above, from a vantage point no human of that era ever occupied. No hill high enough, no flight, no elevation. The plain around Mezhyrich is flat. The bird's eye view had to be constructed entirely inside a skull, then externalized in lines. The capacity for that abstraction existed in Europe during a glacial maximum, in a community living inside the bones of the animals it killed, at a moment when the ice sheet stood not far to the north. Skeptics point out, correctly, that overlapping incised lines on Paleolithic ivory can be read many ways, and that pattern-hungry modern eyes find structure easily. The debate has never closed, but the settlement is not in dispute. The bone architecture is not in dispute. The age is not in dispute. Something at Meserich was thinking in rectangles and rivers 15,000 years ago. The huts themselves were dismantled, catalogued, and reconstructed for display. The mammoths are extinct, gone from the steppe entirely, their species erased so completely that the walls they became are now museum objects. And the small cracked piece of ivory that may hold the oldest plan of a human neighborhood in Eastern Europe sits in a collection, its lines still legible, still unread, a diagram of a world where the roof over your head and the map in your hand came from the same body. Number 3. The Lascaux star clusters. In September 1940, 4 teenagers exploring a wooded hillside near Montagnac in southwestern France squeezed through a narrow opening in the ground and dropped into a chamber no human had entered in roughly 170 centuries. What their lamps found on the walls has never stopped unsettling the people who study it. Aurochs, horses, stags, bison rendered in black manganese, and ochre with a confidence of line that would not be equaled in Europe until the classical world. Hundreds of animals, across hundreds of meters of limestone, some of the bulls stretching more than 5 meters from muzzle to tail. The cave is cool, damp, and acoustically alive. Sound does not simply travel in Lascaux, it returns. The paintings date to approximately 17,000 years ago. The last glacial period was still tightening its grip on the northern hemisphere. Ice sheets covered Scandinavia. The people who made these images hunted across open steppe and lived without agriculture, without writing, without wheels, without metal, and they entered a pitch-black cavity in the earth, carrying fire, to paint the world onto stone. Most of the discussion for 80 years has concerned the animals, but the animals are not alone on those walls. Scattered beside and above certain figures, particularly near the great aurochs of the main gallery, are dots, not smears, not the incidental spatter of a pigment-loaded hand, deliberate rows and clusters of round marks, arranged in configurations that repeat. They have been catalogued, photographed, and traced for decades, and for most of that time they were filed under the comfortable heading of decoration. Then researchers began comparing the clusters to the night sky. Certain groupings, placed near the shoulder of a painted bull, have been proposed as a representation of the Pleiades, the tight knot of stars visible to the unaided eye as 6 or 7 points of light in a cluster containing hundreds. Other dot arrangements in the same chamber have been read as further star groupings, positioned in relation to the animal figures rather than randomly across the rock. If that reading holds, Lascaux is not merely the greatest surviving gallery of Ice Age art. It is a sky map, an astronomical record, painted underground, by people who had no instruments, no notation, and no calendar beyond what they carried in their heads. But here is where the claim becomes genuinely destabilizing. The interpretation remains hotly debated, and the debate itself is the revealing part. The skeptical position is reasonable. Dots are simple marks. Human beings are relentless pattern matchers, and the sky is crowded enough that almost any cluster of points can be made to resemble some grouping of stars. Coincidence cannot be excluded. Nothing in the pigment tells us what the painter intended. And yet the alternative explanation demands its own uncomfortable admission. If those dots are not stars, they are something else that was worth carrying fire into a cave to record. Something worth the labor of grinding pigment, the risk of the descent, the deliberate placement beside specific animals and not others. The marks were not casual. Whatever they encode, the people who made them believed it belonged on the wall. What makes the Lascaux dot clusters particularly haunting is the mental architecture they imply. To record a star grouping on stone requires more than seeing it. It requires holding the sky in memory as a fixed, repeatable pattern, understanding that the arrangement above your head tonight is the same arrangement that will return next year, and the year after, and long after you are dead. It requires treating the heavens as a stable structure rather than a spectacle. That is not observation. That is modeling. A hunter-gatherer standing on a frozen European steppe 17,000 years ago looked up and concluded that the sky had a permanent shape, and that its shape was information. The cave was closed to the public in 1963 because human breath was destroying the paintings. Visitors now walk through a replica. The originals sit in darkness, sealed and climate-controlled, monitored by instruments the painters could not have conceived of. The aurochs still face the same direction they have faced since the ice, and beside them, the dots remain exactly where a hand placed them, holding a pattern that may be the sky, waiting for someone to prove it either way. Number 2. The shaft scene alignment. At Lascaux, the great galleries are generous. The Hall of the Bulls opens like a cathedral, its aurochs stretching across the ceiling in registers meant to be seen. The axial gallery narrows but continues. These are display spaces, painted to be walked through, viewed, shared. Then there is the shaft. To reach it, a visitor must descend from the floor of the apse into a narrow vertical drop, a well in the rock that cannot be entered casually and cannot be entered by accident. There is no natural path. There is no light. Whoever painted what waits at the bottom had to lower themselves into a stone throat carrying fire, and whoever was meant to see it had to do the same. The panel sits in the least accessible part of the entire cave system, deliberately separated from the animal galleries above. What is down there is unlike anything else at Lascaux. A bison, wounded, its entrails apparently spilling, hair bristling along its spine. In front of it, a human figure rendered with a crudeness that borders on deliberate, stick limbs, splayed fingers, falling backward or floating. And the head is not a human head. It is the head of a bird, with a straight beak extending from the skull. Beside the figure lies a spear or throwing stick, and next to that, set on a slender pole, another bird. A bird-headed man, a dying bison, a bird on a stick. Nothing in the great galleries prepares a viewer for this composition. The aurochs and horses above are naturalistic, observed, drawn by people who understood animal anatomy with a precision that took European art thousands of years to recover. The shaft scene abandons all of it. This is not observation, this is symbol. For most of the 20th century, the panel was read as narrative. A hunting accident, a shamanic trance, the bird head signaling flight of the soul, the falling posture signaling ecstatic collapse. A myth frozen mid-sentence in a language nobody speaks. But here is where the reading becomes genuinely strange. Researchers examining the geometry of the panel have proposed that the three principal elements, the eye of the bison, the eye of the bird-headed man, and the eye of the bird on the pole, correspond to three of the brightest stars in the northern sky: Vega, Deneb, Altair, the 3 points that form what modern astronomers call the summer triangle. In this reading, the composition is not a story at all. It is a chart, a fixed arrangement of the summer heavens, painted at the bottom of a shaft, roughly 17,000 years ago. The implications escalate immediately. A triangle of summer stars is not decoration. It is a clock. Those 3 points rise and set on a schedule that does not vary within a human lifetime, marking the turn of the warm season with a reliability that no river, no herd, and no weather pattern can match. A community that could recognize that triangle could anticipate the movement of animals, the ripening of plants, the arrival and departure of the cold. Star tracking is timekeeping. Timekeeping is planning. Planning is the beginning of everything that follows. And if that is what the panel encodes, the shaft scene occupies a category that has no comfortable name. It is not a picture. It is not purely a myth. It is not purely a map. It is all three collapsed into one object. A story about a dying animal and a falling man that also functions as a diagram of the sky and a marker of the calendar, meaning stacked in layers, in a place where only someone who had been told where to look could ever find it. Consider the choice of location again. The Ice Age painters had an entire cave. They chose to place their most abstract, most symbolic, most information-dense composition in the one chamber that requires a descent into darkness to reach. The animals were for the gallery. This was for the pit. The debate over the alignment remains unresolved and may never resolve. 3 points can be drawn onto 3 stars by anyone patient enough to try. But the panel itself does not care about the argument. It is still down there, sealed beneath the hill at Montignac, a bird-headed man falling forever in front of a gutted bison, holding whatever it was meant to hold, in the dark, where its makers left it. Number 1. The Blombos Cave Engravings. On the southern Cape coast of South Africa, roughly 300 kilometers east of Cape Town, a small cave sits in a limestone cliff above the Indian Ocean. It is unremarkable to look at. A shallow mouth, a sandy floor, a view of gray water. Excavations led by archaeologist Christopher Henshelwood recovered from its sediment layers a collection of small pieces of red ochre, each one no larger than a human thumb. On several of them, someone had ground one surface flat and then cut a pattern into it. Not scratches, not tool marks, not the incidental damage of use. A grid. Crisp diagonal lattice lines, cut deliberately across a prepared surface, crossing each other at consistent angles and bounded by parallel lines running along the edges. The engravings are geometric. They are intentional. They are repeated across multiple separate objects from multiple separate layers, which means this was not one individual's idle afternoon. It was a convention, a shared visual grammar practiced across generations. The dates are what destroy the timeline. The Blombos engravings fall between approximately 73,000 and 100,000 years old. Consider what that number erases. The rock art of the Sahara that preserved a vanished world of rivers and cattle is roughly 10,000 years old. The painted galleries of Lascaux, the star clusters and the shaft scene sit near 17,000. The engraved stone from the cave in Navarre is under 14,000. The mammoth ivory from the Ukrainian plain, 15,000. Every object on this list, every candidate for humanity's first map, every contested diagram of fields and rivers and constellations is a recent development by comparison. Blombos predates the oldest of them by more than 5 times over. It predates the peopling of Europe by modern humans. It predates the last glacial maximum. It predates language as we can reconstruct it, agriculture, pottery, permanent settlement, and every institution that human beings have ever built. These pieces of ochre were engraved at the dawn of our species. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Nobody argues that the Blombos engravings are maps. They depict no river, no herd, no dwelling, no coastline. They are abstract, and their meaning is entirely lost. What they demonstrate is something more fundamental and considerably more unsettling than cartography. They demonstrate that the human mind was already dividing space into ordered, intersecting lines, already imposing structure onto a blank surface, already producing marks whose entire purpose was to carry information rather than perform a function. That is the cognitive machinery a map requires. It was present, fully assembled, before the ice sheets had finished their last great advance. What makes this particularly disturbing is the gap. If the capacity for abstract spatial representation existed 100,000 years ago, then between those ochre fragments and the pecked field plans of an Italian valley lie tens of thousands of years of human beings who possessed it. They walked coastlines that are now beneath 120 meters of ocean. They crossed the Green Sahara. They mapped, in whatever medium was available to them, the water sources and the animal routes and the seasonal stars their survival depended on. Almost all of it was made on hide, on bark, on sand, on wood, on surfaces that do not survive. The urge to represent space, sky, and memory is far older than the invention of the map itself. That is what Blombos proves. And it means the objects on this list are not the beginning of anything. They are the surviving fragments of a tradition already unimaginably ancient by the time it reached them. Not the first maps, the oldest ones that happen to be made of stone. The ochre pieces sit in a museum collection in South Africa, catalogued, photographed, measured to the 10th of a millimeter. Their lines are still visible. Their meaning is not. Somewhere beneath the sand of that cave floor and beneath the drowned shelf offshore lie the rest of the marks that generation made, and there is no method, no technology, and no future discovery that will ever recover what they were trying to say. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.